Iqbal here, Curator of Raabta, a public diplomacy initiative by the Serena Hotels. We've had a wonderful journey with all of you for the past 3 years, but with the COVID-19 challenge, of course, we are also digitizing and making sure that the Raabta is still intact. So of course, we have made it all digital, and welcome to our second Conversations of Perspective. First of all, I want to thank you all for appreciating and encouraging us with this endeavor. Our first conversation that was aired on Tuesday with Mr. Shehzad Dada, the CEO of Standard Chartered Pakistan and the president of OICCI, was splendidly received by all of you. And we'd like to continue with the dialogue with, of course, the leading businessmen, the leading policy influencers in the country, and try and understand what are they making of the current crisis and challenge. Of course, COVID-19 has presented itself as a challenge that the whole world is still sort of struggling to make sense of. We are trying to not just battle what is in front of us, but also try and envision what the world of tomorrow would be like. And today we have yet another person with great insight on the matter, who's keeping a close eye on not just how things are developing in Pakistan, but also in the region and the world. We have with us Mr. Illango, the country director, the country representative of World Bank to Pakistan. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Raabta Conversations of Perspective, Mr. Illango. It's a pleasure to have you here this Friday. And what I'd like to begin with is, there was recently a report released by the World Bank cautioning how COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic can be specifically devastating for South Asian economies and countries. I'd like you to sort of share some of the key insights of this report with us.
Thanks, Sidra, for that. And so, yeah, we came out with the South Asia Economic Focus. This is a half-yearly report that the World Bank publishes. So this time, obviously, we focused it on COVID. These are unprecedented times of the crisis, and it is sad to see the situation having gotten this bad with so many unfortunate deaths and all the positive cases. Obviously, besides the human suffering it has brought about, it also has impacted countries, communities, and economies, and which is very evident, obvious, from what you read, what you hear, what you watch. So the South Asia Economic Focus looked at all the countries in the region. And what we are projecting is we are going to see an economic slowdown in South Asia. And in the worst case scenario, it will be the worst in 40 years. And for Pakistan, we're also projecting a negative growth rate of between -1.3% and -2.2%. And obviously, this will have other implications from jobs, employment, poverty, growth, and so on. So that's what the report has concluded. And we've done similar analysis for the other South Asian economies as well.
Well, thank you, Mr. Illango. What you've just spoken about indeed is raising a lot of caution. I think never before have the leaders, have the governments, and of course the authorities faced a challenge where it's lives versus livelihoods, where it's about being able to earn your living, whereas being healthy and alive. So I do want to understand when this report came out, and almost everybody has commented on it, and we've extensively covered it in our television shows as well. What has been the response of the ministries, the departments, and the governments towards it?
So I think it's one doesn't have to take this as a lives versus livelihoods debate. Yes, obviously the wave before all about protecting lives.
Right.
And this has been how we can support governments, including Pakistan, with the urgently needed medical emergency response. And we've been able to mobilize throughout the South Asia countries, and the World Bank established a fast-track facility. And Pakistan was among the first countries to avail financing from that facility of $200 million. Even prior to that, around $40 million we made available from 8 projects to the federal government and provinces to buy the urgently needed equipment like ventilators and supplies like PPE. So therefore, we first focused a lot on the protection of life, and that continues. When it comes to livelihoods and protecting the future, these are the next waves of support that countries need. Fortunately, in Pakistan, the federal government, the Prime Minister rolled out an economic relief plan, and you also saw the central bank governor and the central bank, also the state bank, announcing stimulus package for the private sector. So all these are what most countries are doing around the world, and these includes support and expansion of safety nets and social protection programs, to reducing tariffs for importing equipment and medical supplies that are needed to fight COVID.
Indeed. So it's a developing situation. You've pointed out that people are taking it with a pinch of salt, not just businesses and institutions, but also the governments. But Illango, another question that comes to mind, if I read through and cut through all the analysis and reviews that is coming forward, there's still that recurring caution about how the world is perhaps going to be less open, less prosperous, less growth oriented. We are seeing that the countries are shutting down their borders. Is that going to affect trade? What is going to happen to refugees? Those are questions which are looming. What is your take on the subject?
So, this is after World War II, this is probably the biggest global shock we faced. Yeah, we faced the other shocks like the sub-mortgage, subprime crisis 10 years ago, in 98 in the US, in 2008, then in 98, the Asian financial crisis. But this is one shock that is hitting human health and consequently the well-being as well as the livelihoods, as we discussed before. And what we're going to look at, certainly there's going to be a new way the global order will emerge from this. We already saw globalization was on the retreat. And now with the supply chains having collapsed and trade down to its lowest point, one is going to start looking at what form of, the trade regime that's going to exist, an economic regime that will emerge. And we're going to see whether it's going to be more centered around countries and regions or less so in global sense. But the fact is there's still a part of globalization that is happening even now, fast and furious. It's on data and data sharing. And as you can see, there's a lot more data flowing, and this is good. And this kind of emphasis should be continued. But certainly it is too early to say anything about how this global order will reemerge, and only time can say. But as right now, all countries are focused on fighting COVID, as well as trying to start seeing how lockdowns can be partially lifted and economic activities resumed.
Never before have we seen globalization as our challenge. I mean, there is a lot of comparison being made to, we've had similar challenges before. In 2008 and 2009 as well, there was a global recession. But do you feel that's even comparable? Because even 10 years ago, we were far less integrated. Our supply chains didn't depend on each other. The trade was very different. The way the world has evolved by the time we've entered 2020, do you also feel that it is perhaps, we'll have to go back to the drawing board and globalization perhaps will become a thing of the past? Yes, there will still be comparative advantage, and seeing that advantage is going to bring about opportunities and challenges. But the way we do trade right now, the way we consider ourselves to be global citizens, that's perhaps coming to an end. What is your take on that?
I think you would continue to see a globalization in some scale happening. Obviously, with the COVID crisis, certainly health spread of infectious diseases has become even more an acute issue within the globalization. So you're going to see more, I would say, controls coming in the way of how globalization right now has progressed. And we already saw that happening in the last 10 years from capital flows to financial flows to intellectual property rights and so on. And it's too early for me to define what that globalization would be. But certainly we can expect some changes and some shifts to happen in the way we engage with one another bilaterally, multilaterally, and globally. And only time will say how that will emerge.
So what does this mean for small and medium-sized enterprises, for startups, for people with ideas, the tech startups and incubators? I mean, we've been really encouraging them for the last 5 years, but it seems that their dream of securing funding, of becoming sustainable, has literally, for a lot of them, gone out of the window. I mean, even if we look at the European countries or America, unemployment has really surged up. There have been close to 8 million people who filed for unemployment benefits and bankruptcy benefits in the last 1 month only. So how do you feel the small and medium-sized businesses will respond in Pakistan, and even large-scale businesses? Do you feel that now for them, stability is going to rank much higher than larger or bigger profit margins? Are they going to compromise on profitability or big profit margins and make sure that they have a safety net to survive through times like this and have some safety net or security for even their stakeholders, for people who are doing business with them, for their teams. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that shift is going to come, and Pakistan particularly, but you're looking at, it's a very large informal sector you have. And you have something like 3.3 million micro enterprises, and you have around 3 million or 2.9 million on day wage. And all this points to that, with the kind of crisis everybody faces, from joblessness to loss of enterprises. Certainly, the risk factor is going to be much more sort of playing in the way you start analyzing business decisions. And the question about whether making huge profits is something that everybody will have to start reconsidering and looking at more in terms of what you can give back to the society. How do you build organizations and companies that produce greater good for the community and the society as a whole? And so that perhaps is going to be the way we are going to see how the private sector will begin to start becoming more socially responsible, particularly in Pakistan, with the large number of firms in the informal space. What can you do more to support them to grow out of being micro enterprises and move up a domestic value chain to become small and medium enterprises that get registered, that pay taxes, and that benefit from technology transfer? And eventually they can also start looking at how whether entering regional or global value chains.
I think one of the key questions which has come up is how responsive are the governments, how ready are their healthcare systems, how ready is their machinery to deal with a challenge of this sort. And from the most developed countries to the developing countries in South Asia, everybody seems to be struggling. So what does this mean for government structures? If you come back to how stable governments are going to be, do you feel democracies have failed their people? Do you feel the democratic system is now struggling, and perhaps in the coming days we'll see more failed states coming on, because people are really grappling for some fiscal space, for some fiscal breathing space? What's your take on that?
So let's be optimistic about it, and let's not start talking about failed states and democracies as yet. Let's look at the way how the first wave of the COVID pandemic is contained by all nations. And then as it abates, what kind of economic, socioeconomic measures that need to be put in place to help countries come out of it. Certainly a lot of countries face higher level risk than before. And let's hope it doesn't get as bad as the question you asked. And we will see countries emerging out of it stronger and quicker. For that to happen, medium-term structural reforms across socio-economic sphere need to get rolled out. And this is the time for countries that deferred some of these reforms to actually start implementing them now. And if you do that, and you're certainly going to see quicker and stronger recovery. And some areas like for Pakistan particularly is how do you make the business environment more friendly, including for smaller and medium and micro enterprises, so they can become part of the regular business and they can access credit and they can diversify, they can have technology, and they can continue to do and contribute to the economy. Second would be how can Pakistan expand its revenue base, looking at some of the delayed and deferred tax measures, from general sales tax harmonization to updating the urban immovable property tax to closing the loopholes in agriculture income tax. All that can give you some of the revenues that currently are not available. Third is start looking at rationalizing your expenditure and take out the low impact wasteful expenditure, especially if you look at the state-owned enterprises. They cost the economy about 2% a year in subsidies and loan guarantees. When you compare that with what you spend in the health sector, it's just 0.8%. So you clearly have to start looking at low impact and wasteful expenditures and start consolidating towards spending for high impact results. Fourth would be spending more in human capital, health and education. You have a very youthful young population. What can you do more to sort of get more out of them in the economy. And then, the whole real sectors that we spoke about before, from making investments easy to bringing more modernization and improving productivity. So these are some of the structural reforms that Pakistan can pursue. These are similar measures other countries can pursue to come out of the crisis quicker and stronger.
I mean, all of these suggestions make sense, and of course, it's nothing new. I think a lot of reports by the World Bank, even the IMF, the Asian Development Banks, had similar advice for countries like Pakistan. But I do want to probe you a little more on this and pick your brains, Illango. Prime Minister Imran Khan has already pointed out that we are short on resources. We understand that these structural reforms are important, and at the end of the day, we'll have to be wiser about how we are managing our resources rather than asking for a new ample supply for it. But some of these changes, some of these structural reforms cannot happen over time, and the crisis is very real. It's really urgent. It's an emergency. So how do you see things working in the short term and the medium term? Yes, maybe the structural reforms will come. It's a big wake-up call for the governments, but how will they actually tackle it in the short term? How will they ensure that the trust their people have in them stays, and there is also fiscal space to make sure that some of these initiatives are put in action?
So what I'm advocating is for certain structural reforms that are very institutional and systemic basis, and you can protect the public from facing some of the more harmful effects of doing any drastic structural reforms. For example, the whole question in the power sector, the tariff increase that one keeps talking about, largely goes to pay for capacity payments and fuel adjustment charges of the past contracted independent power producers. Now, the question is, why, and when Pakistan has such high energy costs, higher than other South Asian economies, what the government is planning to do and thinking of doing is looking at working with these private sector firms to realign the costs, so that these kind of capacity payments and fuel adjustment charges could be minimized. And that if you are able to do that, then you don't have to really pass on big tariff increases to the consumers. So it's those kind of smart structural reforms that we would advocate in this time. We fully appreciate and understand that not a whole host of structural reforms can be implemented. We can't ask wide range increases in taxes and revenues, but to start looking at where possible, you can come up with smart measures to increase the revenues, because you need that to kind of be able to close the fiscal gap. And in a fiscally constrained situation, my experience from working in past crises in other countries, this is the time for you to want to look at all this low impact, wasteful spending and seeing whether you can redirect them towards greater support to communities, like what Pakistan is doing through the SAS emergency cash transfer program, is to allocate more towards such programs, or public works program that will ensure that the day wage that's out of jobs can actually be redeployed to work in public works program.
So Illango, we've covered quite a lot of ground. We've spoken about governments, about people, about systems, how responsive they are, how flexible they are, and how quickly can they actually respond to a crisis like this. But I do want to understand how COVID-19 has actually affected politics. Is there a lot of more of blame shifting? The undercurrents, do they remain the same? Has it really changed the politics both within and between states? I mean, our regions, we used to think that they are far more cohesive, they're a lot more integrated. For example, European Union. But now we see fault lines both within countries and within regions. What's your take on that?
So what happens between two countries is entirely going to be determined how the two countries see each other and what comparative advantages they would have. So it's not fair for me to comment on the politics of nations. Being a technocrat, I limit myself to providing and giving you thoughts and ideas on policy and so on. Certainly, COVID is going to change the way society and community looks at itself going forward. So consequently, everything around us will be influenced by how we respond to the COVID crisis and how we are responding now and how we will respond in the weeks and months to come, and how we will respond as we come out of the socio-economic disruption.
Well, thank you so much, Illango, for making time for conversations of perspective, and you've certainly given us a lot of perspective. With your experience and analysis and insights, I think it comes with a realistic dose of caution, but yet there is optimism for the days to come. With this, I think we'll have a very solid foundation to build up from. And a number of our challenges, this is presenting us with a golden opportunity to sort of leap forward. I think the emphasis that has come for the healthcare systems for a country like Pakistan with a vast population, it was unmatched, and I think this is going to be the foundation for the years to come. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, we had with us Mr. Illango, the country director of World Bank to Pakistan, and it was a sheer pleasure and delight to speak to him about how the world is going to look like and transform in the days and years to come. And with this conversation of perspective comes to an end. But once again, thank you very much for receiving us so well and for encouraging us in our digital endeavor. I want to once again remind you that Raabta is going to be live with our digital Conversations of Perspective every Tuesday and every Friday at 10 p.m. Pakistan time. And these conversations are going to be at your perusal. You can watch them anytime after they have premiered, and please do send us your questions and your feedback. We'd love to take them. We'd also want to go live, just taking your questions very soon. Till then, take good care of yourself, and I shall see you next week on Tuesday with a fresh new perspective, with a conversation of perspective.